Webinar. I'm Tom Whitmer and I lead sales at Vertify, and I'd like to welcome you to the combined Vertify Teden Consulting webinar on managing global registries for clinical trial disclosure, challenges and resolution. We believe that you'll find the webinar interesting as you manage global compliance challenges and risk. Speaking today will be Pat Teden of Teden Consulting and Christopher Dedels of Vertify. Pat is president of her own consulting firm and has been involved with clinical registries around the globe through her past roles in industry and through serving on the DIA subcommittee in clinical disclosure. Chris is the product manager for global disclosure at Vertify and also is an active participant of the DIA group on clinical disclosure. Both are frequent speakers at conferences around the world addressing clinical disclosure. Pat and Chris will be speaking today about the challenges facing all of those who are responsible for disclosing trial information to the various registries around the globe, as more and more of those registries are becoming required as opposed to voluntary. Pat has some unique perspectives about things to consider from a process and planning perspective as regards disclosure, and Chris will highlight some of the myths surrounding disclosure and the use of technology to help with management of the disclosure process. A few housekeeping items for today. First, we will be recording the presentation so that we will be providing the recorded presentation for you to download from the Vertify website in the next few days. We welcome you to download it and use it internally. Second, we will be taking questions, but only through the questions mechanism of the GoToWebinar interface. If we have some time at the end, we'll answer a few questions, and we'll do our best to get the responses to any other questions out to the attendants over the next week. We also will be providing slides upon request. And last, both Pat Teden and Vertify with Chris will be attending next month's DIA Disclosure Conference in Arlington, Virginia. So you'll have a chance to meet with them there as well. At this point, I'd like to kick off the webinar with Pat Teden taking over. Pat?
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you for everybody on the phone joining us today as we talk about how to manage global registries. Let's just start by reminding ourselves how global the work that we perform is, that there are registries around the world that capture information about the studies that you sponsor and make that information available to the public. I've represented many of those registries on this slide in two different categories. One are the mandatory registries, mandatory referring to the fact that there is a regulation requiring study registration that becomes public, and voluntary. Voluntary is in quotes because there's also a very strong incentive. Sometimes it's you can't get your study published in medical journals in that particular language. That China comes to mind there. Other times you can't get ethics committee approval without proof that you've registered your trial. So even though there's not a regulation, there is a very strong incentive. Other times it's an industry promise. The post-marketing surveillance registry in Taiwan is actually an industry-sponsored registry. For very good reasons, they are trying to address a perception in Taiwan by making information available to the public. So as you can see, there's a host of registries to be supported by your organization. These lists change very quickly. It always makes me a little nervous to put these lists out in the public because they could have changed since I developed the slide. That happens quite often, actually. Most of the registries only have protocol information. As of now, many of the registries intend to include study results in the near future. At the moment, it's only the CT.gov registry in the U.S. and the UDRA-CT registry in Europe is doing their initial collection of some older pediatric study results, and with their version 9 in the future, we'll be capturing study results moving forward. So in my presentation, I want to focus on 6 different challenges, one being the awareness of the challenge of global registration and results. We're going to characterize some of the global registries, talk about standards leading to consistency and efficiency, process roles and responsibilities, some tracking and metrics, and results. And all of these sections will be broken down into calling out some of the challenges associated with those 6 headings, and then some of the tactics to address those challenges. So the very first thing is awareness. And so the questions are you aware of the registries in which your study information is public? And as basic as that question is, the challenge of multiple registrations for the same trial has been around for many, many years. There are some registries, for example, Italy and South Africa, that were rolled out in the 2005 timeframe. So that trials that you registered on ct.gov, but were conducting the study in Italy or South Africa, those same trials were made public in those registries. And I think most typically with clinical trial disclosure managers being overworked and trying to keep up with all the crazy changes going on in this space, that many had the attitude of, oh my goodness, I'm working so hard to get through the day. I know this is happening, but I'll look at it later. I'll look at it tomorrow to see what those other registries look like and if our data is consistent and what role I should be playing to support my company. So it's actually, even though at the bottom of the slide it says the challenges, now the challenge was actually yesterday. So the second question is, how aware is your management about the scope of global clinical trial disclosure? And the reason that's an important question is you did not get resources, you did not get corporate attention unless your management shares this understanding of the challenges. So because of the pressure at the moment to globalize and globalize well, getting management aware of these challenges is as important, and people are going through the same sort of communication efforts that they went through in the 2006 or so time frame. They're going through those efforts now again. The reason that the challenge is so acute at the moment is because of the EU clinical trial registry opening. So that happened earlier this year. Now you've got 2 huge registries, both ct.gov and the EU clinical trial registry, that has all of the clinical trial application information as of May of 2004 that is being rolled out now. And they've made public about half of those studies that have been accumulating since 2004, so they're making very rapid progress putting in those older studies as well as the new studies moving forward. So if you have low awareness within your organization, that will make change within your organization very, very difficult to obtain. What you want to do is to offer a lot of information to highlight what the issue is. So one way to structure such information is to show evidence at the industry level. So this is a very simple query that I ran on clinicaltrials.gov, and I filtered by industry-sponsored trials and then highlighted countries that industry-sponsored trials were being conducted in. And these 6 countries were sort of picked at random. You can see a fair number of trials. I think it's about 14,000 trials if you add up across all those, just those 6 countries. And those 14,000 trials could be registered in those countries depending on when the registry went into place and everything else. And you have to realize there's probably lots of trials being conducted in those countries that are not in clinicaltrials.gov. So that's a large number of studies showing evidence that the industry information is in multiple places. A second tactic is simply to log into different registries and look for your organization's records. So here's a partial screenshot from the Australia-New Zealand registry. Very simple to put in your company name and see the studies that are registered in that registry for your company. A third tactic is a dashboard that I've made for many of my customers, and it simply lists studies that are conducted in countries that have disclosure, that have registries. And it quite often is an eye-opener for companies, especially companies with a U.S. history, to realize how many of their studies are affected by registries that are outside of the U.S. So it tells a very powerful story just right off the bat looking at it. So the primary tactic for addressing this awareness issue is to use all avenues within your internal corporate communications, newsletters, presentations at staff meetings, pull in outside speakers, have lunch and learns, training sessions, all the tactics that were used within your organization 4 or 5 years ago when the issue of clinical trial disclosure first came up. Moving on, the second challenge we want to focus on is characterizing the global registries. Once you're aware of how many registries are out there, you've got to know a bit about those registries in order to manage your data. And the challenge here is there's just so much to learn. There's so many details about each of those registries. So you'd want to know the URL. You'd want to know whether there's a legal requirement. And if the answer is yes, then reach out and cite the law. If the answer is no, figure out what the other incentive is. Sometimes the other incentive is you'll have difficulty getting ID approval for your study. Sometimes it's an industry commitment to support a registry to disclose information. Figure out what that incentive is. You want to know the scope of studies. What types of studies? Are they biologics, drugs, and devices? Which phases are included and what the implementation dates are. You want to know the important metrics. The metric for initial registration is always important. Frequency of updates. You want to know the language. You want to know the process. And there are 2 primary categories of process. Lots of variations within those categories, but 2 primary process categories. One is that the registry could leverage an existing regulatory process. And the prime example of this is the EU Clinical Trial Registry, which discloses information, select information from the UDRA-CT database, and the input of that information into the UDRA-CT database leverages the clinical trial application process in which you are asking health authorities for permission to run your trial. So it's an existing regulatory process that ends up with a database of data to be disclosed to the public. Or you could have an independent process. An example of that is clinicaltrials.gov. So that process requires that the sponsor, at a timing of their own choosing, assuming it leaves you within the expectations of when the work is done, but it is a timing of your own choosing to turn around and log into the PRS system and input that data, and it's independent of other regulatory processes that are ongoing. And then there's a growing importance of the question about the input methods. As more and more registries come online, electronic exchange so that you can upload information is becoming more and more important versus manual entry only, and whether or not you have direct access to that information as a sponsor. With an independent process like clinicaltrials.gov, you do have direct access. With many of the processes that are leveraging an existing regulatory process, you may not have direct access to your data. So some of the tactics to characterize the global registries. And probably the first step is to develop an at-a-glance summary sheet. And this is something where you will be listing the registries that exist in the various countries and just putting a couple of key characteristics on that summary sheet for each of the registries and post that on your corporate intranet. It's an relatively easy thing to do. It's a good reference for your clinical teams to reach out and double check as they bring on investigative sites to see if there is a disclosure disclosure requirement associated with the use of that site. A more complete way, so it could be your second phase of addressing this need to characterize global registries. A more complete way is to create a manual which details each registry. There's, as stated in a previous slide, there's lots of details that can be included. So pull in the ones that are helpful to you, and there are services that will help deliver that information to you. And the ideal is to have this information be actionable so that you codify the registry information into a format that allows you to have business intelligence and integrate that into your clinical trial management system or your clinical trial disclosure application, so that the application will reach out and say, oops, you're planning on a site in India and they have a registry and this is what you need to do to prepare for that. Standards for consistency and efficiency, lots of challenges here. We have some source documents, primarily the protocol and the clinical study report, that go through a variety of processes. And the goal is to tell, regardless of where the information is disclosed, you want to tell one very crisp story about your study. So when the public reads that story, they're hearing the exact same story regardless of the venue in which they're obtaining the story. So it's important for you to get corporate consensus on the benefit of consistency, and the flip side of that is the risk associated with an inconsistent story. And so once your company has gone through that thought process, and they have a sense of the benefit or the risk, that will translate into resources and how much effort you will be able to spend within your company to obtain that benefit and avoid that risk. If your company decides it's very low risk, it's going to be very difficult for you to get resources. If the company decides it's high risk and high benefit, then presumably the resources will flow from that. And just one note, my observation is that companies whose goal is to do the minimum to achieve compliance are actually less efficient at clinical trial disclosure. That may sound like reverse thinking, but clinical teams get very efficient at performing the same actions for all or most of their studies. If clinical teams have to customize their actions for each study that they're working on, their efficiency goes way down. And the customizations to do the minimum can get very, very detailed. So just as an example, if you look at the FDA AAA, the FDAAA guidance documents, there's a 10-page document to find what an applicable clinical trial is. If each of your clinical teams had to go through all 10 pages and assess studies, it just slows their work down so much. So it's just a sort of a warning that for companies that want to do the minimum, you could actually end up doing a lot more work. So some of the tactics. Be mindful of the clinical trial disclosure requirements when you're creating these source documents, when you're creating your protocols and clinical study reports, or creating the sections of those source documents that will be disclosed. And there's an example here about classifying outcomes very crisply, since primary and secondary outcomes tend to be the outcomes that are required for disclosure, where other types of outcomes, exploratory outcomes, tertiary outcomes, however your protocol labels it, typically are not required for disclosure. And so being clear and consistent in that classification helps a lot. The workshop, the DIA workshop on clinical trial disclosure that is happening next month has a session that is focused on this particular topic that I'm sure everybody on the phone would benefit from. Decide which fields should be consistent. It's very difficult to make all fields consistent, both because the significance of the fields varies, and also because the formatting of that field across registry varies. But decide which fields should be consistent and then manage the information for reuse where you can. And the third tactic is be sure when you're doing this work to not develop your standards from a single registry. Most of us have the majority of our experience or the deepest experience in using clinicaltrials.gov. But you'll find that the approach for how data is captured and formatted in clinicaltrials.gov is very different than in the UDRAC database, for example. The UDRAC database makes extensive use of pick list choices, where clinicaltrials.gov, for that same type of information, will have a free text field. So when you're developing your standards, be aware of the differences in the design of the registries. All right, let's talk for a moment about, let's see, okay. Let's talk for a moment about process roles and challenges. There are different processes used for each registry. We've talked about that. So that when you're using a registry that's leveraging an existing regulatory process, find the process owner in your organization for that regulatory process. That you will not be defining a process from scratch because that process already exists. So you want to find that you want to partner with that process owner. There'll be timing challenges, that the triggers and update timeframes will be different. You'll have different languages. And the resources performing the work. Perhaps you have a centralized clinical trial disclosure group. Perhaps you have a single individual who's your subject matter expert on that topic. You'll have clinical teams, both in headquarters and affiliated companies. You'll have use of CROs. You are unlikely to have control over the selection of the resources because the work will cross so many organizational boundaries within your organization. So you'll end up having to define a process with very flexible resourcing. So if we focus on this very busy slide that illustrates the input of data into the UDRA-CT database, which is leveraging an existing regulatory process. And that existing regulatory process is the clinical trial applications that are submitted. So we have an example here of, I think, let's see, we have Italy, France, and Belgium. Italy and France, CTA 1 and CTA 3, if you can make out that very fine print, have their own registry, so it's sort of a process within a process. The sponsor submits their CTA to the local health authorities. The local health authorities get that information into the UDRA-CT database, and then portions of that information are viewed by the public through the URL that's listed below, the clinicaltrialsregister.eu. So the sponsor does not log in this information directly, and there are some modest exceptions to that. And the timing, it could be months because you're asking for permission to run your trial. The timing could be months before the first patient is actually enrolled. Somebody is already managing this process in your organization. And whoever is managing that process has probably already spent a lot of time working out how to keep those CTAs, which are redundant and in multiple languages, how to keep those CTAs consistent. So there's a lot of learning and experience in that person that the person in charge of clinical trial disclosure can benefit from. Okay, process roles, some of the tactics when you think about the process and the roles. First of all, acknowledge that operations will be distributed, that regulatory processes already exist. You are not making them up. If you're leveraging a regulatory process, it's already there, and you as the subject matter expert for disclosure will work with that process owner. There's language skills. Different languages are used, and difficult to picture a clinical trial disclosure group that's going to have the whole gamut of languages that are required for all those different global registries. The third one is it's easier for your local affiliates to stay up to date on the changing local regulations. And these regulations change very, very rapidly. There is a huge role, though, for the clinical trial disclosure expert. And that role is in the clinical trial disclosure process, standards, the policy. They'll be the business owner for software that helps enable the process, tracking, metrics, training, communications, process improvement, impact assessments with every time the law changes. A big role for the clinical trial disclosure expert. So let's spend a moment talking about tracking and metrics. And I have a big beware sign on this because from my experience, and I am guilty of this also, that I start off, because I'm a data person, I start off wanting to track lots of information, and the number of people who have to do that tracking and input can't keep up with all the information, so the information is not kept up to date, and as a result, the tracking system ends up being not helpful at all. So be very, very selective when you design a tracking system. So that be selective in which studies, which registries, which milestones, who is involved in each study. Decide how much time to invest in tracking and stay within that time frame. Try very hard to automate as much of the tracking as you can. This is one of the huge advantages of a commercial application or any application that is supporting clinical trial disclosure, that some of this tracking will be automated as an offshoot of the application. And think about how you're going to use the information, how it can be summarized. Again, a very common thing with tracking systems is you've got lots of individual data points, but you have trouble getting the output in a format that summarizes it nicely for you so you can see where you stand. So some of the tactics I'm proposing here, I'm very strong recommendations to my customers to track and assess all studies. There's a number of reasons for that. One is that laws change. That observational trial that you registered in clinicaltrials.gov in January of this year, because of the state of Maine law, you did not have to register that trial in ct.gov because of Maine in December of this year, because the Maine law is being retired. So laws change, and people 2 years from now will not remember why that study was registered. Just as important is to document the studies that will not be disclosed. One of the most aggressive questions somebody from the public can ask your corporation or accuse your corporation of is that you're not disclosing all your studies. And you don't answer that by responding, by pointing to the studies you have disclosed. Everybody can see that already. You respond to that by knowing immediately which studies have not been disclosed and having confidence that there's good reasons that they have not been disclosed. If somebody makes that accusation to your company, you don't want to be scrambling trying to figure out what studies have not been disclosed. If you need to start from scratch identifying them at that point, far too much time is going to go by. So track and assess all of your studies. Assure the process supports the registries that are relevant to your company's study portfolio. And when using a registry for the first time, assess the process, the timelines, the various contents for fit with your corporate process and make adjustments as required. Know the process participants. This is so key. Perhaps in the future when systems are incredibly automated, the system will be able to reach out and manage most of these interactions for you. We're very far away from that. So know the process participants. Know who in Italy is registering your information in the Italian registry. Know who in Sri Lanka is doing that work. so that you have a chance of staying aligned, and you have no chance of that at all if you don't know who's doing that work on behalf of your company. And then select limited and meaningful metrics. Focus on results just for a moment. And our experience with results is pretty much limited to clinicaltrials.gov. But the structured database approach for disclosing results is going to be repeated in the UDRA-CT database. So this will, I think, also apply. So if you look at your clinical study report, which can be hundreds of pages, that the same information, once it's put in clinicaltrials.gov, has a very limited scope. The formatting of the data and the way you tell the story about your clinical study report in a clinical study report is very flexible. It can be combinations of text, data tables, and listings, graphs, and in clinicaltrials.gov, it's only the data. In a clinical study report, you can tell lots of different stories in each table. And what I mean by that is a table can tell the story of data observed, change from baseline, change from previous visit. You've got means, medians, standard deviations, ranges. You can tell lots and lots of different stories. In clinicaltrials.gov, each outcome only tells one story, one time frame, one unit. Conclusions can be discussed extensively, where conclusions are not allowed in clinicaltrials.gov. And the clinical study report template, the formatting of that is a very high-level template. In clinicaltrials.gov, you have detailed and evolving standards. So the evolution of the standards makes the learning curve difficult because the rules change as everybody gains more experience in processing results. So the main tactic that I'd like to propose is to consider using a dedicated team to manage and process those study results for the public. And again, this is based primarily on experience with clinicaltrials.gov. That once you get past the learning curve, this results team, the members of the results team, can very efficiently rework the clinical study report into a public format. And then they work with the clinical team and often in partnership with the medical writer. I'm finding that many companies put their medical writers who are writing the clinical study report, which is a different type of medical writing skill than the skill to put results in CT.gov. They're putting that medical writer in charge of the results on CT.gov. And the medical writer is, first of all, a very precious resource within your organization and doesn't have the time to go up that learning curve and become efficient at it. So hence the recommendation for a dedicated team. The clinician and statistician are key members along with the medical writer. And another minor piece of advice is to have a large number of reviewers of your draft results and a very small number of approvers. You need people to be accountable for what is approved and put out into the public. And that accountability gets diluted with a large number of approvers. So I thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'm going to turn this over to Christopher Dedels.
Again, I'll start over. My name is Christopher Dedels. I am the product manager at Vertify. And as part of my duties as a product manager, I talk to a lot of people in a number of different roles. And over the last few years, as I've been talking to people, a number of recurring themes come up. And those themes have to do with global disclosure. And so I put together some of those themes, and as I started to investigate more into global disclosure, I found out that some of those recurring topics turned out to be quite false. And so what I've done is I've summarized kind of the top 5 in this presentation, and I've put together a slide deck that's kind of the 5 myths of global disclosure that I've identified. And so the purpose of this slide is the slide deck is really to provide some tools for you to use immediately and to bring back to your management and peers inside your respective organizations so that you can help to increase awareness and evoke some change in your organization. So I'll just jump right into it. So the first myth that I wanted to present is really you can wait and see what happens. So global disclosure hasn't really hit your organization yet, and you're taking a wait-and-see approach. Well, the truth behind that myth is that global disclosure has happened. And if you're still waiting for the signs, you've missed them. And you need to start taking action. Global disclosure has hit your organization. It may not have hit you specifically as the disclosure manager, but your organization is already coping with global disclosure. You already have people in place that are dealing with the UDRAC regulatory processes. You have people that are doing disclosures in different countries. Pat put up a nice summary in her presentation of trials registered around the world, and somebody in your organization is managing that. So if you think global disclosure hasn't happened yet, you missed it. So you need to take action, and there's a number of ways that you can take action. You can talk to your peers. You can identify process owners inside your organization, and you can talk to some of your colleagues at other organizations. There's a number of events throughout the year that we all attend, and that is a good venue for you to engage with those people and share some of their knowledge, share some of their experience, and learn from them. You can engage with industry experts, and there's a number of industry experts covering a number of different fields, from process improvement and analysis to clinical trial disclosure requirements around the world to clinical trial disclosure software. And a lot of these industry experts provide a lot of information and perspectives for free at the shows, one-on-one sales presentations, and they also have additional services that you can engage with them as well. You can join the DIA SIAC. That is a great venue where registry managers from around the world have often presented global registries, the requirements, the perspectives to the DIA SIAC. And it's also a great venue for discussion among your colleagues and participation and getting your questions in. Lastly, you can attend domestic and overseas shows, and I emphasize the overseas shows because the overseas shows tend to focus more on the registries other than clinicaltrials.gov. So they're also a great source of information as well. The second myth, or the second flavor that keeps coming up in my conversations over the last few years, is that UDRAC is just another registry. I've heard people say to me that I can fill out the CTA form in 2 hours. It's, that's not a problem. That's not really on my radar. Where the truth is, UDRAC is really a complex series of regulatory approvals that have to be carefully managed. There are 31 countries in the European Economic Area, and 32 regulatory agencies, and 26 languages that can be supported. So it is really a multi-dimensional, extremely complex problem that has to do with regulatory approvals, so you can't brush it as a one-off. The other thing is the UDRAC, the data entry screen that we enter data into for UDRAC, that's only one piece of the process. There are other things that have to be submitted with that, and each country, each one of the 31 countries in the European Economic Area has a separate process for approval and management of the UDRAC, of their UDRAC process. So you now have to track 31 different processes to 32 different regulatory agencies in 26 languages. It becomes very, very complicated. For those of us that have a distinct clinicaltrials.gov focus or experience, there was a lot more protocol detail required in the UDRAC information than we're used to. It requires a submission of a different set of information at different time points. So we've now actually introduced additional complexity into the UDRAC process by having a different set of trigger points where information is required and a different set of information that's required at those time points. UDRACT also supports multiple languages, which adds its own dimension of complexity, and it's also going to support results, which is going to add a further dimension of complexity at some point in the future. The third myth of global disclosure is that global disclosure is a content reuse problem. This is one that I hear a lot. And this is one that I think is probably the top one that I hear these days, in that, I've got my data that I've disclosed to clinicaltrials.gov, or I've got my data that was part of my European CTA, and I'm just going to simply copy and paste it into clinicaltrials.gov. I think the problem is a little more complicated than that. Different registries have different requirements and are designed for different processes. The UDRACT process is primarily a clinical trial application process. Its primary goal or objective is not disclosure. And so it's going to have a different set of requirements than clinicaltrials.gov will, because it's got a different objective. And because it's got a different set of requirements, the rules around the data that's disclosed and the constraints on the information is going to be different from registry to registry. So your disclosure information is actually going to have multiple truths. You're going to have different information disclosed in different registries, but what you do want to do is you want to make sure that those different sets of information tell the same story. You want to weave together a nice cohesive story so that there are no gaps or risks exposed through your disclosure process. So I went out to the internet to try and find a simple example of this. So I went and I looked at the study phase field in PRS and clinicaltrials.gov. And I said, how many different definitions could there possibly be for study phase? And what I found was actually a little bit alarming. PRS defines a number of values in its drop-down list for study phase. And we're all familiar with those. So I wanted to find out what the corresponding options were in UDRACT. And I found that UDRACT has quite a fewer number of options than PRS supplies. And then I said, within Europe, how does it vary? How does this study phase definition vary within Europe? So I went to DKRS, which is the German clinical trial registry, arguably an economic power in Europe. And they have quite a bit more definitions for study phase than PRS does. So PRS and UDRACT combine everything into phase 3, but DKRS makes a distinction between phase 3A and 3B, should your companies choose to classify your studies in that way. And then I went to a different continent. I went to India, and I said, how does India define it? And largely we're back to the PRS definitions, but there is one exception, or two exceptions actually. They don't define a phase 0 study, and they have an additional one called post-marketing surveillance. So even across a very small sampling of registries, we've got quite a wide variation in something that I think is fairly straightforward, like study phase. We've got a large number of variations, and so you may have to report different values to different registries, but this is an example of where you want those different values to tell the same story. So the truth behind this myth is that global disclosure is not simply a content reuse problem. Depending on where you start and where you want to end up, you may have to change the data in your disclosures depending on the individual rules and requirements of the registries to which you're trying to disclose. And so your disclosure will have multiple truths, and your disclosure process requires not a content reuse strategy, but more a content management strategy. And content management is going to allow you to track and report on different variations of your content across registries so that you can very quickly assess risk. Content management will also support decentralization of your process. Now that we're all focused on clinicaltrials.gov, it's very easy to centralize that process. But as we start to focus on more and more registries, we're going to have to decentralize and leverage local assets inside of our organization. And content management is also going to support a collaborative experience for your process. So everybody will be able to contribute to everybody else's disclosures in a uniform way. The fourth myth that I hear quite frequently is that HL7 is going to solve all my problems. And the truth is that HL7 is just one tool in your toolbox. Now, HL7's goal is to develop a method for your organization to communicate with the global registries. It does not address any challenges in the process, who owns the process, the timing of the process, the trigger points that trigger specific disclosures, training inside your organization, workflow. It doesn't address anything that happens inside your organization that's part of the data publishing process. All it addresses is how to get the data, once it's published, from your organization to the registry. It does nothing more than that. So that is going to be a very valuable tool in your toolbox because it's going to help you standardize your disclosure process in a very big way. But the standardization that it's focused on is external to your organization and not necessarily part of your internal process definition. The other challenge with HL7 is that it really supports a content reuse model, not a content management model, which, going back to the previous myth, is really required to have a very efficient global disclosure process. The last myth that I hear very frequently is that global disclosure is unmanageable. It is a very difficult process to get your hands on, and so I'm not even going to try. Well, other than being the wrong approach, I think that global disclosure is extremely manageable, but you have to have the right set of skills, the right set of people, and the right set of tools contributing to your process. You also have to have the right process defined because an inefficient process or an out-of-date process will only hinder you and not help you. You have to find the right mix for your organization. You have to assess within your own organization whether a centralized model or a decentralized model works for you. As I said before, and as Pat's mentioned, it's easy to be centralized when all you're focusing on is clinicaltrials.gov. But as we start to expand the focus to more clinical trial registries, we're going to have to decentralize more and more. And the reason we're going to have to decentralize more and more is because we're going to have to start to depend on the skills of our team members in the individual countries to which we're trying to disclose. So we're going to have to leverage their knowledge of the local language. We're going to have to leverage their knowledge of the local regulations. We're going to have to leverage their knowledge of the process, their knowledge of the process that the regulatory authority follows. And so those are all assets in our disclosure toolbox that we need to start capitalizing on. And it's up to you as a disclosure manager to assess what do we keep centralized, what do we decentralize in a way that works for your organization. A quick tool that you can build, and actually a very low-tech tool that you can build, is what I call a disclosure master file. And a disclosure master file is really a documentation of the core set of information relative to a trial. And the master file becomes the source of all clinical trial disclosures. So it could model the WHO 20 requirements. It could model PRS requirements. The bottom line is, once it's approved and distributed to the individual global disclosure teams, they use the disclosure master file as the starting point for disclosure in their geography, region, whatever that may be. With your disclosure master file, you will start to get improved consistency across global registries. So your disclosures from one geography to the next, or one registry to the next, will start to get more and more coherent and collaborative. it's important that you build and or acquire tools. And these can be low-tech tools or they can be high-tech tools. There are tools out in the market which will help you assess the requirements for each registry. There are tools that will help you manage the clinical trial disclosure process. There are tools that will help you with collaboration and with timing of disclosure updates to the registries. These are all tools which exist in the market. There are some low-tech tools that you can build very quickly and very easily inside your organization to do the same thing, and Pat touched upon a few of those. And so it's important that you start to build those tools and that skill set and that knowledge base inside your organization. Next one, very important that you try to standardize your processes as much as possible. If you can at all, standardize your process so that all of your distributed disclosure groups follow the same process. And if you can, let the tools that you build handle the nuances and tweaks for each registry. So if you can standardize the content publishing process and then have some kind of a tool or a separate process manage the actual disclosure to the registry, that will save you in training your teams, communicating requirements, and a lot of other internal process considerations. And it will make that process much more manageable, much more scalable, and much easier for you to update in the future. Lastly, it's important that you leverage the skills of your team. Pat mentioned this too. Somebody in your organization is doing this already. You need to seek that person out. You need to establish what their knowledge of the process is, and you need to leverage that wherever possible in a way that you can capitalize on it to get the global disclosures done. Quick wrap up. I think that global disclosure requires a new way of thinking. We're going from a centralized one registry model to a multiple registry model. And I think that it's going to require a new way of thinking. We have to move from content reuse to content management. We have to start to build tools. We have to increase our internal knowledge and our internal capital. We need to define some standardized processes where possible. And this is really critical to make the process management scalable, manageable, and updatable in the future. We also need to deploy the correct tools for content and process management. Without tools for tracking, reporting, identifying new requirements, it's going to become very difficult for us to manage this process going forward as it starts to grow. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I'm going to turn it back to Tom for a few closing remarks.
So we actually have a couple of seconds here. We do have one question, and we'll remind folks if you can please submit the questions on the question button down on the bottom right. We have a question, and I'm not sure exactly which of these folks is going to answer it, but what are companies doing in preparation for version 9 of the UDRAC release? Pat, I'm not sure if that's something you're comfortable with, or Chris wants to take that.
Well, version 9 of the UDRAC release is the version that's going to focus on capturing results. So the very first thing that is required of sponsors and is ongoing and has an upcoming target date at the end of this month is to submit the pediatric results, which will not be in the format of version 9 since that's not available yet. But that is focused on the reporting of results in Europe. And then in preparation specific to version 9 is simply keeping track of the information that is shared by the developers of the UDRA-CT application. So they have field definitions that have been released, and they're very good about going to conferences and giving updates on where things stand. Quite often it's frustrating because you want to hear more than they're willing to say in public because it's just not there yet. but as decisions are made, they are sharing them. Now, Chris, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, again, I'm just going to second what Pat says. I think that to prepare for version 9, which is, I think, going to be a fairly major revision of UDRAC, I think from a procedural perspective as well as a content scope perspective, is really to just stay engaged at this point. During the release of version 8, there was user acceptance testing, which people could get involved in early so they could get a leg up on the requirements in a practical way. They can engage and provide comments on the documentation that's been provided, and the EMA is very good at attending conferences. They participate in a big way in HL7, and frankly, they respond to simply just queries very rapidly. So I think they are very engaged. And the best way for companies to get involved is to just stay engaged with what's happening in Europe. And the conferences and the DIA-SIAC provide a nice consolidated way to stay up to date with that information.
Okay, Chris, thanks, and thanks, Pat. So actually, we're bumping up on the hour. There are a couple more questions, so I'll tell you what we're going to do. We will respond to these questions via email to everybody as best we can. We and Pat Teden will both be at the DIA show on September 13th and 14th in Arlington. If you have additional questions that you think of, send them to marketing@vertify.com, and we will disseminate those after reviewing them. And if you like the presentations, send the request to the same thing. We will have the recorded webinar on our website in a couple of days, and all attendees today will be receiving a white paper on the kind of the 5 pillars and myths dealing with the global disclosure. We thank you for your time today, and really appreciate taking time out of a very busy time and what you have to do every day to spend some time with us. Thank you.